Over the course of my life, I've met quite a few unusual people. Some of them were strange. Some of them were downright unsettling. One man in particular still comes to mind. As they say, when someone dies, you either speak well of them or not at all. So I'll change his patronymic in this story. Let's call him Nikolai Ionovich. I met him when I first started working in retail. Back then we shared a small office. In fact, most of the basics I learned about practical trade work came from him. At first glance, he looked like a frail old man. Short, thin, his back was bent almost in half from scoliosis. I thought he must have been around 75. He had a long, hooked nose, a completely bald head, and small, unfriendly eyes. The kind that always seemed to be watching you. He reminded me of an evil gnome from a fairy tale, or Koshai the Deathless. The resemblance was made even stronger by the black work coat he wore every single day. Because of his short height, the long hem of the coat almost dragged along the floor. Since we worked in the same room, I had plenty of time to observe him. And Nikolai Ionovich was quite a character. Two of his wives, I later learned, had died within just a few years of marrying him. By the time I met him, he was already a widower. Maybe that's why he behaved strangely around women. Most of the day he sat at his desk, muttering sarcastic comments about everything and everyone. Always grumpy. Always dissatisfied. But the moment a woman walked into the office, something in him changed. Store managers and merchandise buyers would often come to him to process documents. We worked at a wholesale food base, and they came to pick up supplies. The younger and prettier the woman was, the more animated Nikolai Ionovich suddenly became. A healthy, perfume-wearing lady would sit down next to him at the desk, and the old man would instantly start smiling. He'd crack jokes, often very inappropriate jokes. But women who worked in Soviet trade were used to that sort of thing. They'd just giggle and ignore it. But for Ionovich, that wasn't enough. When the paperwork was finished, he would always stand up to escort the woman out. And right before she left, he would casually hug her or pinch her somewhere soft. Then he'd return to his chair, looking extremely satisfied. His cheeks would turn rosy, his glasses would shine, and he'd sit there with a contented little smile. But something strange often happened afterward. The woman who had just left the office would suddenly start complaining about dizziness. Sometimes she would even end up taking sick leave. I didn't notice this pattern at first. The women themselves eventually told me about it. I had a pretty wide circle of acquaintances back then. I was a Komsomol activist after all. Once, they even had to call an ambulance for a store manager right at the warehouse. She fainted about 10 minutes after leaving Ionovich's office. Of course, no one tried to connect the two events. What could a harmless old man possibly have to do with it? Sometimes people simply feel unwell, especially women. But during the year that I worked beside Nikolai Ionovich, I began noticing something disturbing. He seemed to have a strange ability to drain energy from people, and not only from women. Men suffered too. He was responsible for approving payment orders for the warehouse loaders, so every day they had to come to his desk. Of course, he didn't pinch them. Instead, he drove them absolutely furious. Sometimes he'd nitpick their work. Sometimes he'd miscalculate their pay. Sometimes he'd invent some completely ridiculous complaint. the loader would start arguing with him, trying to prove he was right. And Ionovich would sit there calmly, adding sarcastic remarks that only made things worse. I watched these scenes many times, and every time I noticed something unsettling. As the argument grew more heated, the old man seemed to change. The wrinkles on his face smoothed out, his pale yellow skin became pink again, and his dull, metal-colored eyes suddenly looked alive. Meanwhile, the loader was practically foaming with rage. When the man was already shaking with anger, Ionovich would suddenly pat him on the back and say something like, all right, maybe you're right after all." The poor guy would calm down and leave, but he looked completely drained, like a squeezed lemon. And our dear Koshchei would sit back down in his chair, brew himself some tea from herbs he brought in a small linen bag, and relax. He never drank the tea from the warehouse, and he absolutely hated the smell of coffee. That was Nikolai Ionovich. Later our jobs changed and we ended up working in different departments. I moved to a retail store and Ionovich was transferred to a social supply warehouse. That place was considered extremely prestigious during the years of food shortages. Condensed milk, canned meat, all kinds of scarce goods meant for schools, hospitals, and kindergartens. But I suspect those products weren't what interested him most. He had never been a foodie. A small sandwich and his herbal tea were enough for him. No, the real attraction was something else. At that warehouse, there were far more female visitors. Besides store managers, now school principals and hospital administrators were coming too. Fresh blood, so to speak. One day I visited him there myself with a special note to get some scarce supplies. At first, I didn't even recognize him. He looked smooth-skinned, healthy, rosy. It was as if he had grown 20 years younger. Even his permanently bent back seemed straighter. He ran around the warehouse between sacks and boxes like a tireless little machine. Later, the women from our trade network started telling some disturbing stories about him. One female store manager, a large woman at least 3 times his size, said that he once attacked her in the back of the warehouse. He pushed her onto a pile of sacks and seriously tried to rape her. She barely managed to break free from his bony grip. What shocked her most wasn't the attack itself. It was his strength. She couldn't understand how such a frail body could possess such terrifying force. Soon after that incident, the woman became seriously ill and was eventually forced into early retirement because of disability. I saw her about a year later. It was frightening. She used to be a healthy, rosy-cheeked woman. Now she was thin, aged, with yellow, wrinkled skin and a hunched back. And she wasn't the only one. There were several similar cases. No one ever went to the police. For one thing, none of the incidents technically ended in rape. And for another, Russian women, especially those working in trade, weren't the type to file police reports over an old man's wandering hands. So Ionovich continued his strange games, but only for a while. One spring, during an icy morning, he slipped on the sidewalk and broke his hip. At his age, that diagnosis is almost a death sentence. He became bedridden. His third wife, with whom he had been living at the time, disappeared almost immediately, just vanished. Of course, he had relatives and social workers checked on him, but he started wasting away quickly. People from our workplace went to visit him. What they described was horrifying. He was nothing but skin and bones, yellow, weak, unable to get out of bed. Whenever someone came close, he tried grabbing their hands with his skeletal fingers, but people pulled away, out of fear, out of disgust. They left him oranges and vitamins and hurried away as quickly as possible. Less than a year after his fall, he died. One morning, a social worker came to help him around the house and found his body on the stairwell, completely frozen. He lived alone on the top floor of a 5-story building. No one could understand how he had managed to get out of bed, crawl across his entire 4-room apartment, open the front door, and drag himself down the stairs to the landing between the 4th and 5th floors. I attended his funeral. I won't even describe what he looked like in the coffin. Let's just say the skeleton lying there looked about 100 years old, maybe older. They hadn't even shaved his stubble. Perhaps no one wanted to touch him. But the real shock came when someone mentioned his age. Nikolai Ionovich was only 69 years old when he died. My grandmother in Novosibirsk lived to be 104, and even at the end, she looked younger than that corpse. Years later, I sometimes think about him, and I'm almost certain the broken hip wasn't the real reason he died. I believed that once he was trapped alone at home, cut off from other people, he simply lost his source of energy. Without others to feed on, he began to fade. And that final crawl to the stairwell, maybe he used the last strength he had left, hoping to run into someone, anyone, someone whose life he could steal one more time. Sometimes you feel an overwhelming urge to become a part of something great, something unusual. An ordinary, quiet life becomes dull surprisingly quickly. After all, you believe you're special, yet the people around you never seem to notice any talent in you. That's when the long and restless search begins. A search for yourself, for your true place in the world. Old authorities lose their meaning. New ones can appear in the very first person you meet. And if you're lucky, that person might actually be someone worthy of admiration. Years ago, I became fascinated with classic English and American horror stories. Things like the Weeping Well series, and of course, the works of H.P. Lovecraft. One idea especially stuck with me, that anyone could open the doors to other worlds, but only the strongest minds could return with their sanity intact. That thought was incredibly alluring. Luckily, my curiosity never went further than reading books. Some instinct for self-preservation must have kicked in. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said about some of my friends back then. As time passed, I stopped dreaming about encounters with the unknown, but the unknown, it seems, hadn't stopped looking for me. There were moments in my life that simply refused to fit into any logical explanation. The kind of moments that could easily drive a person insane if they thought about them too long. For example, the time I encountered a woman who seemed to be possessed. You might say, that happens sometimes. There are documentaries about it, videos on YouTube. And you'd be right, but only partly. Let me set the scene. It was an autumn evening. The sky hung low, heavy with the promise of cold rain. The city had begun to glow with night lights. I was riding in one of those small yellow minibuses that run through the city. The interior was worn and ugly, but still warmer and more comfortable than standing outside in the damp air. There were 5 passengers in total, including me. One man sat near the driver. The rest of us were scattered around the cabin. The radio quietly gurgled with some cheap pop station. At the next stop, 2 more passengers got in. I glanced at them out of habit. Normally I wouldn't care who stepped inside. That's when the nightmare began. They were strange women. Judging by their conversation, they were mother and daughter, which sounds normal enough, but something about them felt deeply wrong. Even their clothing gave the opposite impression of what you'd expect. There were other odd details too. The older one was thin and looked exhausted, around 60 years old maybe, yet her voice sounded surprisingly young. The younger one looked about 40, very large, with reddish blotches across her face. So, which one do you think was the daughter? Exactly. The older daughter constantly held her overly energetic mother by the elbow. By that point, the minibus had already been driving for a while, yet the two of them still couldn't sit down. Every time they chose a seat, they would suddenly stand up and move somewhere else. At first, it was almost amusing. But then the large woman with the red spotted face, who I privately started calling Fat Face, began forcing other passengers to move. And not just one or two people. Everyone she looked at. The bus wasn't even full. That's when it started to feel wrong. Then things escalated. A guy sitting closest to her finally told her to stop. A heavy silence filled the bus. The woman's face stretched into a strange, stupid smile. And then, in a single second, it twisted into something so animalistic that it sent chills down my spine. She started screaming at him, but not with one voice. It sounded like several voices screaming at once, as if 3 or 4 different people were shouting from the same throat. Real fear settled over the bus. The older daughter shrank into her seat, staring at her mother with a terrified expression. Passengers jumped up, trying to calm the woman down. The driver stopped watching the road and started yelling too, trying to intervene in the chaos. And me? I lowered my eyes to the floor and started quietly reciting the Lord's Prayer. At first, nothing changed. The bus was still filled with chaos. The woman screamed curses at everyone who spoke to her. Not just insults, real curses. Between the shouting, she burst into horrible, cruel laughter. Then suddenly, through all the noise, I heard her scream something different. "Where are you? Where are you? I can't see you. Stop it, you bitch. I'll find you. It hurts, you bitch." A cold wave ran down my spine. I had only one thought in my head. Don't look into her eyes. I kept praying. Suddenly she shouted, "It's hot. We're leaving. We're leaving." The problem was, the minibus was already on the highway. There was no stop anywhere nearby. The woman began throwing herself against the door. People were yelling. I kept praying. Finally, the driver slammed on the hazard lights, cursed loudly, and opened the doors. The 2 strange women ran out into the rain. The red-faced one kept screaming outside, shaking violently like a dog after jumping out of water. Then we drove away, and suddenly, everything was quiet, as if nothing had happened at all. To finish the story, I should mention something else. I didn't start praying out of pure fear. At first, it was more like something I'd been taught to do. But then I felt something strange, a sense of pride creeping into my thoughts. A nasty little voice inside my head whispering, "See, you can do this. Look how strong you are." And the moment I focused on that feeling, the words of the prayer started slipping, tangling. Pride is a dangerous thing. Once I realized what was happening, I forced myself to ignore those thoughts and focus only on the prayer, the words, the rhythm. I didn't stop until the bus started moving again, and that was the end of it. Well, most people have probably heard the famous story of Anneliese Michel. First, let me briefly tell you about her life. Anneliese Michel, September 21st, 1952 to July 1st, 1976, became widely known because her story inspired films such as The Exorcism of Emily Rose and Requiem. She suffered from severe nervous disorders starting at the age of 16 and continued to struggle with them until her death in 1976. Her death is widely believed to have been connected, at least indirectly, to a series of exorcism rituals. Her parents, along with 2 priests who performed the ritual, were later charged with negligent homicide. The exorcisms were carried out by Pastor Arnold Renz under the guidance of Bishop Joseph Stangl. During this time, the unfortunate girl was subjected to extreme suffering. She was deprived of food, constantly tormented, and sometimes not allowed to sleep for several days at a time. The ordeal eventually ended with her death. Anneliese's soul, now cleansed of satanic forces, the pastor reportedly told her devastated parents, has ascended to the throne of the Almighty. To this day, some people believe that she truly was possessed by the devil. Anneliese was born in 1952 in a small village in Bavaria. Her parents were deeply religious, and this had a strong influence on how she was raised. In 1968, she began suffering from severe epileptic seizures. Treatment in a psychiatric clinic brought no improvement. In fact, while she was there, Anneliese fell into a deep depression. At the same time, sacred objects such as crucifixes and churches began to cause her intense revulsion. She gradually became convinced that she was possessed by a demon, and the lack of success in medical treatment only strengthened that belief. Doctors prescribed more and more medications, but none of them helped. On July 1st, 1976, at the age of 23, Anneliese died. The autopsy showed that the cause of death was dehydration and severe malnutrition after months of repeated exorcism rituals. Another hypothesis suggested that her death may have been linked to the long-term use of the medication carbamazepine, which she had been taking for several years. Back in 1969, when Anneliese was 17, a doctor diagnosed her with epilepsy, even though her electroencephalogram showed no abnormalities. Many strange details only surfaced after her death in 1976, largely because of the unusual court case that followed. Despite the autopsy revealing no signs of epilepsy in her brain and confirming death from dehydration and starvation, the blame continued to fall on the 2 priests and Anneliese's parents. They were even denied permission to exhume the body. So what caused Anneliese to destroy sacred relics, violently twist her head from side to side as if her body were no longer under her control, and eat spiders, flies, and even pieces of coal? Anneliese Michel was born on September 21st, 1952, in the Bavarian town of Labelfing, but she grew up in Klingenberg am Main. Her name was a combination of 2 names, Anna and Elizabeth. Her parents, Anna Ferg and Josef Michel, were extremely conservative Catholics. While such strict beliefs were unusual in Germany at the time, they were far more common in Bavaria, a stronghold of Catholic tradition. They rejected the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. On the 13th day of every month, they celebrated the feast of Our Lady of Fatima. A neighbor named Barbara Weigand, who once walked 5 hours on foot to a Capuchin church to receive communion, was considered a spiritual example within the Michel household. Anneliese attended Mass several times a week, prayed the rosary regularly, and often tried to go beyond what was required of her faith. For example, she sometimes slept on the floor during the middle of winter as an act of religious devotion. In 1968, an incident occurred that initially seemed harmless. During a spasm, Annalisa accidentally bit her own tongue. But a year later, strange nighttime attacks began. During these episodes, her body would become rigid. She felt a crushing weight on her chest, and she was unable to speak or call for help. She could not call her parents or even her 3 sisters. After the first attack, she felt so completely drained that she didn't even have the strength to go to school the next day. However, the attacks did not repeat immediately, and for a while she even returned to normal activities like playing tennis. In 1969, she woke up one night struggling to breathe, unable to move her arms or body. The family doctor, Gerhard Vogt, advised them to consult a psychiatrist. On August 27, 1969, an EEG showed no abnormalities in her brain. Later, however, Annalisa developed pleurisy and tuberculosis and was hospitalized in Aschaffenburg in early 1970. On February 28th, she was transferred to Mittelberg. On the night of June 3rd that same year, another attack occurred. A new EEG again revealed nothing suspicious. Nevertheless, Dr. Wolfgang von Haller recommended medical treatment. Even when the third and fourth EEG tests, conducted in August 1970 and June 1973, showed the same results, the doctors continued the treatment. While in Mittelberg, Annalisa began seeing demonic faces during the rosary prayer. In the spring, she started hearing strange knocking sounds. After examining her and finding nothing unusual, Dr. Vogt referred her to an otologist, but he also found nothing wrong. Soon afterward, the same knocking sounds were heard by her sisters as well. According to Annalisa herself, she began to feel possessed around the age of 13. One of the first people who noticed something strange was Thea Hein, who accompanied her on a pilgrimage to the Italian town of San Damiano. She noticed that Annalisa avoided an image of Christ and refused to drink water from a sacred spring in Lourdes. 4 years of medical treatment, including anticonvulsant drugs such as Tegretol and others, produced no improvement. On November 15, 1972, during a general audience discussing the Church's spiritual struggle against evil, Pope Paul VI stated, "The presence of the evil one is sometimes very real. We may suspect his influence where lies become powerful and hypocritical in the disguise of obvious truth. One may ask what means or measures should be used against the actions of the devil." On September 16, 1975, after consulting the Jesuit Adolf Rodwick, Bishop Stangl authorized a formal exorcism according to canon law. The ritual was based on the ancient Rituale Romanum, first compiled in 1614 and expanded in 1954. Annalisa claimed that 6 demons controlled her. They identified themselves as Lucifer, Cain, Judas Iscariot, Nero, Fleischmann, and Hitler. From September 24, 1975 to June 30, 1976, nearly 70 exorcism rituals were performed. 1 or 2 took place every week. 42 of them were recorded on audio tape and later played in court. The first ritual began at 4 p.m. and lasted 5 hours. Whenever the priests touched her, Annalisa screamed, "Take your hand away, it burns like fire." The attacks were so violent that sometimes 3 people had to hold her down, or she had to be chained. Yet between these episodes, she often seemed completely normal. She attended school and church and even passed exams for the Würzburg Pedagogical Academy. On May 30, 1976, after attending one of the rituals, Dr. Richard Roth reportedly responded to Father Ott's request for help with the words, "There is no injection against the devil." On June 30th of that same year, Annalisa, suffering from pneumonia, said to her mother before going to sleep, "Mum, stay with me. I'm afraid." These were her last words. The next morning, around 8 a.m., her mother found her dead. At the time of her death, Annalisa weighed only 31 kilograms. On April 21st, 1978, the district court in Aschaffenburg put Annalisa's parents and the two priests on trial. It remains unclear why the parents were denied permission to exhume the body. One of the priests later claimed that he was not even allowed to enter the morgue. Interestingly, Cardinal Joseph Höffner, head of the German Bishops' Conference, publicly stated that Annalisa had not been possessed. Yet only days later, he admitted that he personally believed in the existence of demons. A study conducted in 1974 by the Freiburg Institute of Marginal Psychology found that only 66% of Catholic theologians in Germany believed in the existence of the devil. Personally, I believe she really was possessed. Mental illness doesn't just appear out of nowhere like that. One moment, everything is normal, and suddenly a person's mind collapses. Exorcism itself is an extremely dangerous thing. I once watched a video where a demon was supposedly being cast out of a woman, and smoke was coming out of her ears and nose. The priests and the witnesses claimed it was real. But anyway, back to the story. Those 42 hours of audio recordings seemed to suggest that something truly strange was happening. Still, I feel sorry for the girl. You live your life, everything seems normal, and then something like this happens. Leave your thoughts in the comments about this story.